All right, so you're here because you want to really get a good grasp on something pretty complex, but without it, becoming a whole big thing.
Yeah.
Right? That's kind of the whole point of this deep dive. And we are tackling the leadership of Prophet Muhammad.
Yeah.
Peace be upon him.
Yeah.
And we've got some seriously fascinating material to work with here. And it looks at his influence in so many different areas of life.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're going to do is we're going to try to really pull out those key principles, whether it's about spiritual guidance, political leadership, his take on social issues, economics, even military strategy, family life, conflict resolution, all of it, and try to figure out why these insights are still so powerful even today.
Absolutely. And I think, what really strikes you when you first start looking at all this material is the sheer breadth of his impact.
Yeah.
It wasn't just limited to one specific area,
Right.
His leadership really shaped the entire early Muslim community. And I think what this material gives us is a really fantastic opportunity to explore how all these different aspects of his leadership were actually interconnected and driven by this consistent set of core values.
Okay, so let's jump right in and start with his spiritual leadership.
Right.
I mean, obviously his role as the final messenger in Islam and the concept of monotheism, that's huge.
Yeah.
But it feels like it goes way deeper than just, delivering a religious message.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
His spiritual leadership was deeply woven into his own personal conduct, and you can see that throughout the sources. They highlight his profound devotion and moral compass, and also coupled with this real sense of empathy and compassion for others.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about what he preached, it was about how he lived and embodied these principles.
Right.
And I think that saying, the best among you are those who have the best manners and character. It really brings that home.
Yeah.
He placed so much emphasis on ethical behavior as like a fundamental aspect of faith.
And it wasn't just this general encouragement to be a good person, right?
No.
The material really highlights his dedication to prayer, even going above and beyond with those voluntary night prayers to Tahajjud.
Yeah.
It's pretty powerful stuff. And that quote, the closest that his servant comes to his Lord is in prostration.
Right.
It really gives you a sense of his personal connection with the divine and how vital that direct relationship was to him.
Yeah.
Do you think that deep spiritual connection had an effect on his broader leadership? How so?
That's a really fascinating point. I think that deep personal connection, it probably fostered a profound sense of accountability that extended beyond just his followers. It instilled this humility and this constant striving for moral integrity. And I think that would have naturally informed his decision-making in every single area, whether it was leading prayers or leading the community.
It makes sense.
It wasn't just about ritual. It was this continuous effort to align his actions with his belief.
Right.
And as the material notes, that spiritual grounding, it showed up in his daily life through things like reflection, charity, and a rejection of material wealth and excess.
Yeah.
He set a very powerful example.
Okay, so building on that spiritual foundation,
Yeah.
he then steps into this role of political leadership in Medina.
Right.
And this is where things get really interesting, to me at least.
Yeah.
He's not just a religious figure anymore, right?
Right.
He's the head of state.
Uh-huh.
And there's this document that comes up a lot in the sources called the Constitution of Medina.
Yes.
For people like you and me trying to understand how significant that was back then and even today, what stands out to you?
Well, I think when we think about the context of 7th century Arabia, the Constitution of Medina, it was truly revolutionary.
Yeah.
It basically created this framework for a society where different religious communities, Muslims and Jews included, they had clearly defined rights and responsibilities, but all within a single governing structure.
That's pretty amazing.
It really was, this idea of diverse groups coexisting peacefully and with mutual respect under shared leadership. It was quite unprecedented.
Yeah.
And it kind of raises the question, how did he manage to create such a unifying document in a time when tribal divisions were, so strong?
Right.
It's a big question.
It is. And the sources, they outline these core principles of his political governance: justice, inclusivity, meritocracy, accountability.
Right.
Let's talk about justice for a second.
Okay.
It sounds straightforward enough,
Yeah.
but how did he actually put that into practice in a way that was different or notable for his time?
Well, the emphasis on justice meant that everyone, regardless of their background, their faith, they were entitled to fair treatment under the law. And there are accounts of him consistently upholding this principle of justice, even when it went against the interests of his own supporters or his own tribe.
Wow.
Yeah, this commitment to impartiality, where the law applied equally to everyone, it was a huge departure from the norms of that era, where lineage and power often dictated outcomes.
Yeah, you're right.
And inclusivity wasn't just about tolerance, it was about actively involving these different communities in the life of the state.
Right.
And then you have meritocracy, which meant that appointments to positions of responsibility, they were based on competence and character, not just social standing.
Interesting.
And the concept of accountability, which was tied to his understanding of divine law, meant that even he, as the leader, was not above scrutiny.
It sounds like he was dealing with some really complex social dynamics there.
He was.
Having to balance this authority with humility and always keeping the welfare of everyone in mind.
Exactly. And the sources, they highlight this delicate balance as a really key aspect of his political leadership.
Okay.
It wasn't about consolidating power for himself. It was about serving the community in accordance with this higher moral framework.
Right.
And it makes you think, how do leaders today balance that authority with service effectively?
That's a great question to consider.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about social leadership.
Oh.
This is where we see some really profound changes happening.
Yeah.
The sources talk a lot about his role in championing things like social justice, women's rights, and taking care of the most vulnerable people. Can you paint a clearer picture of what some of these changes actually looked like?
What's really striking is how he challenged and dismantled so many deeply ingrained social injustices that were just accepted as the norm.
Right.
So, for example, the outright prohibition of female infanticide, that was a radical step.
Yeah.
And granting women rights to inheritance, to education, to participate more fully in society.
Yeah.
These were revolutionary changes for that time.
Yeah.
The sources also point to the fundamental principle of human equality that's laid out in the Quran.
Right.
And that really underpinned all of his social reforms.
Interesting.
It challenged the existing hierarchies based on tribal lineage and these ideas of, inherent superiority based on who you were born to.
It sounds like he was really trying to level the playing field.
It was.
And it wasn't just about putting new rules in place, was it?
No, not at all.
His personal behavior seems to have had a massive impact as well.
It did.
That saying, the best of people are those who are most beneficial to others. That really sets a high bar for how we should be interacting with each other within a community.
It does, and he really led by example in his daily life. His generosity, his kindness towards neighbors, regardless of their background.
Yeah.
His active efforts to protect those who are weak and marginalized. These weren't just abstract principles, he lived them.
Right.
The sources also highlight his humility and accessibility, which is so important. I mean, the image of a leader who would sit with the poor, attend to the needs of his companions, even participate in household chores.
Right.
That's in stark contrast to a lot of the rulers of his time.
Yeah.
It really demonstrates this deep personal commitment to the well-being of all members of society.
So what does that tell us about the kind of leader he was?
I think it shows that he genuinely cared about people, and he wasn't afraid to, get his hands dirty and lead by example.
Okay, so that focus on fairness and ethical conduct,
Yes,
that seems to have carried over into his economic leadership as well.
it did.
The sources describe it as being deeply rooted in those principles. So tell us a little bit more about his approach to economics.
Well, having been a successful merchant himself,
Right.
he had a very practical understanding of trade and commerce. But his leadership always emphasized ethical dealings above all else.
Okay.
Promoting fair trade, free from exploitation and fraud, that was central to his approach.
Yeah.
And the prohibition of interest, or riba, was a key part of that ethical framework. It was all aimed at preventing the exploitation of people in need.
Interesting.
And he really valued things like trustworthiness and transparency in all financial transactions.
So these concepts of zakat, the obligatory charity, and sadaqah, voluntary giving,
Yes.
they seem really important in understanding his vision for economic fairness, don't they?
Absolutely. Those mechanisms were designed to redistribute wealth within the community and create a safety net for the less fortunate. Okay.
Zakat, being mandatory, served as this systematic way to address economic disparities, while sadaqah encouraged this ongoing generosity.
It's a really interesting system.
It is.
And the sources also highlight his encouragement of honest labor and his condemnation of practices like hoarding and monopolies,
Right.
which could obviously create instability and inequality.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how those principles would apply to the complexities of our modern economic systems.
That's a really good question and something to think about.
Okay, now this next topic might surprise some people, but the sources talk about military leadership. And it's important to remember that he was operating in a context of pretty intense opposition and conflict.
Right.
And even within that context, they highlight some really progressive principles of warfare that he established.
Absolutely. It's crucial to understand that his military engagements were largely a response to persecution and threats to the safety and security of the community.
Okay.
But the sources really emphasize his strategic thinking and the discipline that he instilled in his followers.
Right. What's particularly remarkable are the ethical guidelines he laid down for warfare.
Yeah.
Things like the strict prohibition against harming non-combatants,
Right.
against destroying crops and civilian infrastructure, and damaging religious sites. Those were really groundbreaking for that time. And, they stand in stark contrast to a lot of the conflicts we see historically and even today.
Yeah, it's a very different approach.
It is.
That example of the conquest of Mecca and his forgiveness of his former enemies.
Yes.
It's so powerful.
What?
Why is that such a key illustration of his leadership, especially in a military context?
I think it's because it's this amazing demonstration of both magnanimity and strategic thinking. After years of conflict and facing severe persecution,
Right.
his triumphant entry into Mecca was marked by amnesty, not retribution.
Wow.
Yeah, and that act of forgiveness not only prevented further bloodshed, but it played a huge role in unifying the population and establishing a lasting peace.
Makes sense.
It showed a level of leadership that prioritized reconciliation and long-term stability over revenge.
Really putting the well-being of everyone first.
Exactly. And the sources point out that his military actions weren't about personal gain or territorial expansion.
Right.
It was about defending the community and establishing this just and peaceful order.
It's pretty remarkable how those ethical principles extended even onto the battlefield.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, so let's shift focus again.
Okay.
The sources also delve into his leadership within his family and his personal life. Why is it important to look at this more intimate sphere?
I think it's because it gives us a more complete picture of his character.
Right.
It shows us that his principles weren't just for public life. They were deeply ingrained in his personal interactions as well.
Okay.
The sources describe him as a loving husband, a caring father, and someone who actively participated in household tasks.
Interesting.
The saying, "the best of you is he who is best to his family," really underscores the importance he placed on these domestic relationships.
And his relationship with his first wife, Khadijah, gets specific mention. So what can we learn from their partnership?
Well, theirs was a relationship built on deep mutual respect and partnership.
Right.
Khadijah was his strong supporter both emotionally and materially from the very beginning of his mission.
Wow.
And the fact that he valued her counsel and cherished their bond, that's a really powerful example of gender equality and shared responsibility within a family.
Yeah, it really is.
And his interactions with children were marked by affection and patience,
Right.
highlighting the importance of nurturing the younger generation and teaching values through example.
Okay, so the last thing the sources touch on is his leadership in resolving conflicts. And they talk about his reputation, even before his prophethood, as Al-Amin, the trustworthy one.
Yes.
It seems like this ability to mediate disputes was something he was known for throughout his life.
Absolutely. His reputation for trustworthiness, even before he became a prophet, it speaks volumes about his character.
Right.
And his innate ability to find common ground and bring people together. There's that well-known story about his role in arbitrating the placement of the black stone in the Kaaba,
Right.
which is a classic example of his wisdom in de-escalating tensions and fostering unity.
Yeah,
He came up with a solution that was acceptable to all parties involved.
it's a great story.
And then later on, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, even though it seemed unfavorable to his followers at first. That's another key example of his approach to conflict resolution.
What do you think is so important about that particular event?
Oh, it really demonstrates his remarkable patience and long-term strategic vision.
Okay.
While the immediate terms of the treaty might have seemed like a concession,
Yeah.
it ultimately paved the way for a more lasting peace and wider acceptance of his message.
Interesting.
It shows his willingness to prioritize peaceful resolutions even when it required compromise and, looking at the bigger picture.
Right.
His focus was always on finding pathways to reconciliation and understanding, even with those who had opposed him.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that Prophet Muhammad's leadership wasn't just this moment in history.
Right.
These sources present a really enduring model.
Yeah.
Out of all the leadership qualities we talked about today, which ones stand out to you as being the most relevant and applicable to the world we live in today?
I think the qualities of patience, wisdom, justice, and compassion, which come up again and again in the sources,
Yeah.
they are undeniably timeless.
Right.
In a world that's grappling with so much division, injustice, and conflict. His example of inclusive governance, his commitment to social justice, his emphasis on ethical conduct in every area of life.
Right.
They offer really valuable lessons for us today.
It really does give you a lot to think about.
It does.
I mean, if we were to actively consider and apply those principles
Yeah.
in our personal lives, in our workplaces, and how our societies are structured, it feels like it could lead to some pretty significant positive changes.
It really does this exploration into his leadership. It reveals a figure who wasn't just a spiritual guide, but a truly holistic leader. He addressed the spiritual, material, and social well-being of his community with extraordinary wisdom and foresight.
So for all of you listening out there, here's something to ponder.
Okay.
Which of these many facets of leadership, the spiritual, the political, the social, the economic, the way he approached conflict, even his family life,
Yeah.
which one of those resonates most strongly with you right now in your own life or in the challenges you see around you?
Right.
And how could a more conscious effort to apply that specific principle,
Yeah.
how could that lead to some unexpected insights or even solutions?
It's a great question.
It's definitely worth thinking about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.